Welcome everyone to this dialogue on development research, focusing on the theme of human rights, citizenship and good governance in Africa. We are very happy to have Patience Mususa and Cristiano Lanzano from the Nordic Africa Institute as keynote speakers today. This dialogue series is an initiative by the Development and Aid Policy Team at Stockholm Environment Institute and SWEDEV, the Swedish Development Research Network. My name is Elisabeth Olivius, and I'm a member of the SWEDEV Executive Committee and an associate professor in political science at Umeå University in Sweden. So SWEDEV is a member-based network that was constituted in November in 2019. The network aims to connect development researchers across Sweden in order to strengthen collaboration within the research community and to increase interaction between development researchers and practitioners. So we seek to support the use of research-based knowledge for efficient policymaking and practice among Swedish actors working for the 2030 agenda. At our website, swedev.dev, you can learn more about the network and you can also sign up as a member. The second organizing actor behind this dialogue is the Development and Aid Policy Team at SEI. And this was formed in September 2022 in response to an internal project looking at the development dimensions of the work of SEI. SEI is conducting a lot of work within the development field and has a dual mandate to work with development and environment, but has so far mainly been recognized as an environmental think tank. So this dialogue series is a way for the DAP team to learn from research and build further networks. And both the DAP team and SWEDEV has raised the need for learning spaces and dialogue platforms for development research that can connect research and practitioners. So many countries have institutes situated at this intersection between research and development, policy and practice, but Sweden has so far lacked a dedicated institution for this. So the aim of these dialogues on development research is to try to create one type of space like this. So through the dialogues, we aim to disseminate findings of development research and create a learning space where researchers can share their work. So we invite development researchers from around the world to share their findings and insights with researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And today I'm now very happy to give the floor to Eleanor Fisher, Head of Research at the Nordic Africa Institute, who will moderate this dialogue and further introduce our keynote speakers.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Yes, I'm Professor and Head of Research at the Nordic Africa Institute. We're a Nordic knowledge hub for collaborative research, library services and communication that supports deeper understanding of contemporary African perspectives, challenges, opportunities, in particular to inform Nordic policy on Africa. We're also proudly an institutional member of SWEDEV. We hope that will continue. I would like to introduce my colleagues, Patience Mususa and Cristiano Lanzano. But before I do, I will also like to mention and introduce Professor Henning Melber, who's an NI associate, has many affiliations to his name, but is also the outgoing director of EADI, the European Association of Development and Research and Training Institutes, since 2017. I mention this particularly because EADI is an institutional support member of SWEDEV. Thank you. So turning to my colleagues, Patience Mususa is a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute with me here in Uppsala. She's an environmental anthropologist specializing on mining and urbanization with a regional focus on southern Central Africa. Patience is the author of a monograph, There Used to Be Order, Life on the Copper Belt After the Privatization of Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines. Perhaps I'm biased, but I would recommend it, highly recommend it. And this is with the University of Michigan Press. She is also co-editor with Stephen Marr of a special issue of the Politics of Climate Action in African Cities with Urban Forum, which has recently come out. Turning to Cristiano Lanzano, also senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. He's a social anthropologist interested in the environment development nexus. informal economies, natural resource management and extraction in West Africa. In the last years, he's conducted a lot of research on small-scale gold mining in Burkina Faso, Ghana, Guinea. He's also published this work in a range of interesting high-quality journals. So I'm very proud to be here with my colleagues. Just before I hand over to Patience, I would maybe like to set the scene a little on the topic area and give you some background on how it has evolved. At the Nordic Africa Institute, we're co-funded by the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in early 2020, they approached us asking if we could develop a piece of work on the politics of citizenship in Africa, which we were very happy to do. This was led by Henning, alongside Cristiano, Patience, and another colleague called Jesper Bjarnason, who couldn't be with us today. Now, the purpose of that piece of work was to feed into the conversation on the development of a new Africa strategy within Finland, which has now proceeded, and to inform policymakers. So we produced a piece of work and then did a number of private briefings with policymakers. We then had a public output, which is a policy brief, which I believe has been shared with you, the politics of citizenship, social contract and inclusivity in Africa. And then just coming out of the press, we haven't got it to share with you today, but it will be coming out very, very shortly, is an article in the Forum for Development Studies, Citizenship Matters, Explorations into the State-Citizen Relationship in Africa. And all this work is looking at how citizenship as a universal legal norm is given meaning and relevance in ways that are shaped by historical trajectories, political systems, and state government relations to members of society. So linking to how state policy affects perceptions of citizenship and civic behaviour by those governed. So very, very topical. The work we did with Finland and subsequent work sort of presents an overview of current challenges relating to citizenship in sub-Saharan Africa, suggests that a deliberate policy promoting and embracing a positive notion of citizenship could be an opportunity for states and governments as well as citizens. So that's the background to the presentations that Cristiano and Patience are going to give. I'm about to now hand over to Patience, and then Patience will hand over to Cristiano. If you please pose questions now in the chat function as we go along, as they come to you. I've decided not to have a break between the two presentations. We'll take all the questions at the end after Cristiano's contribution. Patience, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Eleanor. And it's really kind of a good opportunity to kind of sit here with a broader community to present on our collective work and thinking about some of the kind of key challenges to thinking around the kind of state citizenship relation in African countries and how policymakers grappling with that, in particular in relation to, as Eleanor mentioned, a much more inclusive approach and kind of thinking around the kind of governance issues and kind of and the social contract. And so this is a question that both policymakers and academics in the kind of post-colonial African context have been grappling with. How to frame this relationship between citizens and a state in a multifaceted context of particular colonial histories and also covering aspects of belonging, how you bring people together, organize the economic structure, but also the kind of politics amidst the context that's undergoing great social change. And so Cristiano will present more on the kind of trends later in terms of kind of the shifts in demographic factors and communications and technology and the forms of political contestation that are shaping citizenship discussions on the continent. But for now, I would like to turn to the kind of broader themes and discussions. So kind of one of the key issues that has been grappled with is on how to have an inclusive notion of citizenship in a context in which the post-colonial state built a nation on the basis of what was an exclusionary form of nation making. And here is kind of worthwhile to turn to the particularities of citizenship in African states. So the contemporary nation state in Africa emerged largely as a result of colonial expropriation, spearheaded in part by corporate entities in the Southern African context in which I work in, the British South Africa Company, that sought partnership with imperial powers, such as Britain, to legitimate the extraction of resources and labor. This was a pattern that was replicated across Africa in territories appropriated by Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, reflecting economic interest, but also competition within Europe for global spheres of influence. And here it's kind of worthwhile referring to the Berlin Conference and the partition of the continent into these kind of distinct geographical zones. It also created a citizen-subject divide wherein a racialized identity classified into a minority of citizens on racial patterns, and ethnic identities, categorized in particular groups, created a notion of belonging, which was kind of hierarchical, created kind of hierarchies across different groups. And such divisions, contributed to particular distinctive forms of citizenship that find expression in some of the contestations that emerge in African countries around, what particular group belongs or doesn't. And these historical developments, we argue, illustrate how the state, through an array of provisions, can also kind of abuse its power in relation to who's included, but can also be potentially expansive in terms of who it includes. And this is an area in terms of, the kind of inclusive and potentially exclusionary dimensions, which remain and continue to be a contested area of, and a potential area of conflict. But it's also an area where individuals, through civic action, can potentially transform themselves from being, i.e., subjects, into citizens where their agency is acknowledged and recognized, i.e., in making a case for belonging. And this is where, these dimensions of citizenship, where historically ethnic identity and state authority have kind of contributed to a kind of separation of rights and obligations, either in terms of imagining a minority group as citizens and others as subjects. And this is where effectively the kind of broader inclusive framework of rights and belonging is still, we argue, a work in progress. And so with this kind of a brief introduction on what the particularities of citizenship in African states are, in our paper and our work, we argue for that, one, a more inclusive approach to citizenship would safeguard the rights of those who have been displaced by conflict, particularly given the particularities of a very, very mobile continent, which is host to one of the largest, both internally displaced, but also refugee populations in the world. And so, for example, and this would kind of safeguard the rights of those who've been displaced by conflict, and would also kind of facilitate their process towards inclusion and full participation in economic life. A second argument in our case, for an inclusive notion of citizenship, would link into the kind of post-independence Pan-African ideals and an aspiration of a Pan-African identity, which would foster, in particular within a mobile continent, a much more inclusive notion of citizenship that recognizes not just those who are, fixed to particular places, but also those who are mobile. And while this is kind of, a really quite complex, I think to kind of argue kind of falls within the kind of discussions around kind of global citizenship, we make a case that there is a potential for states to guarantee this much more inclusive notion of citizenship. A third case for citizenship is that it should also ensure that the benefits and skills and investment to kind of host countries that that residents bring and contribute to would also provide them with the access to state services such as health and benefits that oftentimes are not available to significant populations who, as a result of these gaps in these formulations of citizenship, kind of fall outside the gaps. And so overall, we effectively argue that in our work that the kind of pragmatic approach to citizenship that centers the state as a kind of guarantor for these kind of for belonging in a kind of quite complex, mobile, and overlapping situation of residence, mobility, would guarantee, at least in the interim, a way in which one would have a much more inclusive way to participate in social life across the continent. And here I'd like to turn to my colleague, Cristiano, who would describe a little bit more about time.
Thank you very much, Patience. I see you're getting broken up. Could I please urge everyone to, if you have questions. I see we're getting broken up. Please urge anyone to post questions in the chat. We'd really like questions for you, and I will turn to them after Cristiano has finished. Cristiano, can I please hand over to you?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Patience, for introducing my section so well. In one passage of our brief on the politics of citizenship that Eleanor has mentioned before, we mentioned the structural adjustment programs that were imposed by international financial institutions on most African countries in context of spiraling debt during the 80s and 90s. We all know, with the aim of slimming down the bureaucratic machines of post-colonial states that were often deemed redundant or inefficient, cutting public expenses and encouraging privatization. Many scholars see these programs as one of the first manifestations of the neoliberal hegemony, and some have recently stressed how they served also as a sort of general rehearsal for the subsequent wave of austerity measures in different areas of the world. And that's from this historical reference, maybe a rather unpleasant one for some, that I would like to start my intervention. In the brief, we mentioned the structural adjustment programs, mostly, in my view, as a way to historicize the trajectories of the relation between the states and citizens in Africa, to contextualize and historicize, in particular, the perception of African states as failed, absent, or incapable to cater for the needs of their citizens and fulfill the social contract. The debates about the meaning and the impact of what we call today neoliberalism abound, as we all know. And several scholars, such as Beatrice Ibou, have argued that with the advent of neoliberalism, actually the prerogatives of the state were not simply curtailed, they were reshaped and redeployed. and that the state has transformed itself, adapting to the demands of new public management and the landscape created by the outsourcing of services, giving birth to what Achille Mbembe has called forms of private indirect government. In any case, for most people, the disinvestment brought by these structural adjustment programs was the element that delinked the material manifestation of the state's obligations to its citizens. Some decades later, now, the climate has quite changed. Neoliberalism may not be over, but for example, the 2008 financial crisis and more recently the socioeconomic consequences of the COVID pandemic have seriously undermined the consensus supporting austerity measures, for example. Retrospectively, both the World Bank and the IMF have recognized the shortcomings in their past approach and recommendations. And it's curious that the same two institutions, in a number of studies, as well as in their lending strategies, are now advocating and supporting, for example, for social transfer programs as safety nets. In most cases, it's about, for example, cash transfer programs that are modeled on the early Mexican and Brazilian examples. Bolsa Familia in Brazil is probably the most famous example. But these kind of programs exist in a lot of African countries today. These social policy measures have been extensively discussed and are rapidly on the rise. One of our newly acquired colleague of the Nordic Africa Institute, Marion Uma, has written extensively on this kind of social programs. And their urgency has particularly emerged during the COVID pandemic, obviously. This renewed demand for social programs certainly signals a change in the debate on public policy and the need for rethinking the social contract as primarily articulated around the protection of the poorest and the most vulnerable. However, the last wave of cash transfer programs also raised questions linked to the sustainability and continuity of their funding, the capacity of such programs to reach their target populations, especially when many work in the informal economy and not everyone has access to procedures of birth registration or formal identification. One of the most unexpected but also most interesting motivations to support the notion of a permanent social transfer, in other words, a universal basic income of some sort, has been provided to me some years ago by a South African colleague at a workshop where I was participating in Pretoria in South Africa. There were different presentations and different discussions going on at the seminar, feeding into rather visionary debates about the human economy. That was actually the name of the research program based in Pretoria that organized the meeting. And it was about the future of digital money, cash transfers, and other present and future forms of redistribution. And that colleague said, well, we citizens of Southern African countries, he claimed, should be entitled to a permanent income funded by the royalties and the revenues of mining activities in our countries, because that would be even barely compensating the amount of labor that we put in the sector and the degree of dispossession and exploitation that we historically endured because of the mining sector. And I found that was very interesting way and very meaningful way, in a way that condensed a lot of political claims that have been articulated in different forms in the African continent recently. I do not know if that specific argument has been scaled up and become mainstream, but it helps me connect here to the question of social policies that I evoked before with another point that we touch in our shared reflection, and that is the role of natural resources. We know that in many African societies, official borders and formal notions of citizenship and the authority of the state coexist with different other forms of belonging. Patience was also reminding us of that. Ethnicity, for example, and with competing sources of power, such as regional and traditional chieftainships. And all these forms of power that we label as customary or traditional are closely associated to the question of access to natural resources and rights over natural resources. They not only affect the rights of use, inheritance, or sale of specific groups over certain resources and land primarily, but in return they are shaped by these groups' livelihood practices and political claims in a mutually constitutive relation. More particularly, it's access to land that has historically been embedded in a set of relationship and practices depending on identities and membership to lineages and ethnic groups. At a first glance, we might be tempted to think that these questions are about a gradually disappearing past. They may be good to think for historians, geographers, and some ethnologists, but have little to do with current concerns about renewed notions of citizenship. And our point in the brief and in the article that we published recently is exactly the opposite. That the question of who is entitled, sorry, I lost a bit my note, the question of who is entitled to access, to use, to borrow, to transfer, to invest in specific portions of land are not only the object and prerogative of norms, rituals, spiritual values, and authority figures. They are intimately related to the definition of individuals' positions in larger groups. So these questions define the boundaries of community and the essence of social and political belonging. And local contestations of foreign ownership and control over natural resources have been increasing. Think of cases where foreign investments in agriculture and large-scale purchases of land from abroad are resisted locally and are dubbed as land grabbing, or where the presence of large-scale mining and fishing concessions is contested by both small-scale miners and fishers and environmental activists. So when national governments or when specific political forces that are active in the national public sphere espouse this cause, their stance is labeled as resource nationalism. Supporters of this shift emphasize citizenship as an ensemble of collective rights and entitlements over the natural wealth of one's country, as opposed to unregulated access by predatory foreign investors. And the political discourses motivated by resource nationalism can build on anti-capitalistic or anti-imperialist arguments on the revival of a socialist past, as it was to a certain extent during Magufuli's presidency in Tanzania, with the tightening of state control of international mining companies. Or in other cases, resource nationalism can take more explicitly exclusionary form, such as during the anti-Chinese rhetoric in the 2011 election campaign by President Michael Sata in Zambia, or the so-called war on artisanal gold mining in Ghana in the last few years. And these manifestations of resource nationalism link notions of belonging, citizenship, and associated social and economic rights. They may play out in terms of ethnicity and autochthony, highlighting the situation of legal pluralism where most post-colonial states find themselves, and the possible tensions or convergences between different competing sources of legitimacy and authority. And to make an example from the recent history of Burkina Faso, where I conducted most of my fieldwork research during the last years, if we think of the 1984 preamble of that year's version of the Land Reform Act, which was promulgated under Sankara's revolutionary junta, well, there in that text, traditional land chiefs were defined as feudal powers that had to be defeated and replaced by an integral nationalization of land by the central state, in order to remove the inegalitarian remnants of customary law that was based on ethnicity and communal belonging, and replace it with supposedly modern, egalitarian, and in the case of Sankara, socialist-leaning principles. But only one decade later, during the 1990s, so during the post-Sankara normalization, so-called normalization period of the 1990s, multilateral aid programs instead promoted in Burkina Faso, as well as across all Western Africa, schemes of land formalization and land titling that implied the active collaboration and the participation of customary chiefs. In that context, re-establishing instead a conversation between the state and the local power authorities that historically preceded it was seen as a way to include rural populations and guarantee the stability of the modern state institution. And finally, 8 years ago, in 2014, when the 27-year-old regime of President Blaise Compaoré came to an end after a popular uprising that was provoked by the president's attempts to force the constitution to secure a further mandate in power, the Mogo Naba and other traditional chiefs were solicited as mediators during the first days of the transitional phase to guarantee a peaceful outcome of the mobilization. This was just one trajectory, one example of the many possible interactions between a national or central state that is supposed to represent, with all its flaws, the general interest or the strive for equality of all citizens, and local traditional authorities on the other side that guarantee social belonging and unequal or differentiated inclusion at the local level, but in a competitive and non-universalistic or supposedly non-universalistic model. And of course, the outcomes and the possibilities materialized by this interaction are not a given and change accordingly to the context and the actors, but they remain a relevant point for discussion on the reproduction and the renewal of the social contract. And the last point, and then I will conclude, the 2014 uprising in Burkina Faso that I was mentioning right now was largely the result of youth mobilization. And this brings me to another element that we highlight in our article, and namely the political role of the young generation. As we know, Africa is experiencing a demographic boom. The continent's projected population growth may see the African population double by 2050, and nearly 41% of this population is below the age of 15. The age group of 15 to 24 years old constitutes almost 20% of the total population. These are, I believe, United Nations data from 2017, but I think we should be still along these lines today. And of course, you have narratives, optimistic narratives on one side about a new, more aware generation that can change the continent, that are continuously countered by more alarmist depictions of a youth bulge or concerns and preoccupations about Africa's jobless growth and mass unemployment. In our shared work, we try to look at what the most recent waves of youth political mobilization offer in terms of potential to update, so to speak, to renew the notion of citizenship in Africa today. A growing proportion of young citizens, in combination with the implementation and consolidation of multi-party democracy, gives young, often urban voters considerable influence over the ballot. At the same time, formal political structures continue to entrench power among the older generations and perpetuate gerontocratic tendencies. But these tendencies are being challenged by emergent youth and feminist movements that are mobilizing on issues of access to services, land, jobs, and resources. So many African states recently witnessed large-scale political protests with youth activists in the lead. Street protests provided young people a platform for political engagement. They have often recently centered on democratic principles rather than personalized or party politics. And these include protesting the extended terms in office of incumbent presidents, as I was mentioning, or more broadly, the political manipulation of the constitution in order to facilitate elite entrenchment. Think of the recent cases of Burkina Faso, Burundi, Guinea, Senegal, and DRC. Such mobilizations illustrated young citizens are aware of their rights. They confront governments with their demands. And for a new generation that was dubbed by Herrera with reference to the Egyptian Spring as a wired generation or cyber citizenry, youth mobilization combines long-standing means of communication and coordination with technological innovations such as the transformative role of the internet. So despite the challenges in internet access, a citizenship issue in itself in the information age, African governments increasingly fear the internet and its potential to overturn power structures. During protests, state authorities have limited access through internet disturbances or total shutdowns. So in a way, through the creative use of media and new technologies, but also using the strength of their associational networks, new generations of activists are contributing to reshape and advance, although not without bumps and blockages, the debate about what it means to belong to a social and political community, what are the obligations and entitlement of citizens, and most of all, what are their expectations from their governments in terms of protecting social rights, guaranteeing basic freedom, and opening possibilities for future well-being. There were many other points that we touched in our text, but I will now conclude on this note and maybe leave the space for further engagement with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristiano, and thank you very much, Patience. Maybe I can I hope to have some questions from the audience, but maybe I can kick off with a question to you, Patience, to draw you back in. One of the things I was reflecting as we were talking is, in what way might African experiences of citizenship inform broader global debates on the topic of citizenship? I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
That's a really good question, Eleanor, and it's something that we've been having kind of post the policy brief and the paper, a discussion amongst ourselves, in that kind of the structural adjustment policy and kind of austerity policies adopted in African countries have the expression in a variety of ways, actually across the globe. If you think about Greece, the discussions in the UK, and also the context of deindustrialization in the US, and also kind of questions around how you guarantee welfare and kind of entitlements to a broad range of and a wider range of residents who might not be citizens but are residing in specific locales amidst this context of, some would say, a kind of uneven state retreat, right? And so looking to the dimensions of, you know, how are that kind of continuous process of reflection and grappling with identity and belonging, and looking at those debates and where they go is really quite interesting. And increasingly you have, you know, Africa scholars such as Francis Nyamjo, Ndlovu Glasheni from South Africa, effectively calling for kind of politics of conviviality, i.e. as a way of having a much more inclusive notion of belonging that does not seek to kind of exclude particular group, but tries to kind of find means and ways of including a wider range of people who reside, for them to kind of effectively participate fully in social life, but also kind of meet the obligations of living in particular locations. And I think the anthropologist James Ferguson recently actually kind of published a book which kind of talks about the politics of presence, grappling with similar questions around what do you do when you have people living among you that are contributing to society but might not be documented. And he calls effectively for something quite similar as a kind of politics that recognizes the presence of those who are among us and figuring out how to include. So I think it's interesting to kind of, and he draws very much as well on the African case to argue that African perspectives in terms of belonging, when one looks historically, have often tended to see kind of wealth in relationships and wealth in people, linking again to this notion of conviviality and a kind of shared sense of belonging.
Thank you, Patience. And if I to pick up in relation to the politics of presence, but also wealth in people, Cristiano, you were making very pertinent points about the political role of the younger generation. And I wonder whether I can push you a little in terms of what this implies for citizenship. For instance, whether you have whether you can make it more concrete with examples or the trends within the West African region that you'd like to complement what you were saying with.
Yes, I think when we started reflecting about the issue, some of the current trends, for example, in the Sahelian area and the West African area, were still in the making. And today it's also impossible to think about these questions that we are speculating about today without thinking about, at least for in the West African space, of the crisis of insecurity and the recruitment of many young people in non-state groups, in armed groups, and this is of course a fundamental challenge that questions the very existence of central state and their monopoly of violence and of the control of force. There are no, I don't think that I have a straightforward question to that, but I think it's certainly a coagulation of social cleavages and social claims, or some of which we evoke in the brief. I mean, a lot of disputes on land and tensions between agriculturalists and pastoralists, for example, have transmigrated into these violent episodes, and one of the challenge of the state in West Africa today is exactly how to organize the resistance or counter these trends, and with what degree of legitimacy left for the nation state, and also how to deal, I think, with the multiple attempts from different actors, for example, self-defense groups, hunters, brotherhoods, and all other kind of both customary and more recently formed actors, to also do something about the violence, to restore security in a way. There is, for example, currently, it's been discussed in Burkina Faso, which has experienced a series of coups in the last year, which are very tied to a very high degree to the current situation of violence and security. The discussion is being led as to how to integrate some of these militias and self-defense groups into the formal structure of the army, and so how to use the capacity or the willingness of groups of citizens to organize by themselves and to arm themselves and to resist jihadist groups in a way that leads both to their inclusion but also to their control. So in a way, what is the space and the margin of autonomy of these young people getting together in self-defense groups and contributing or not to the defense of security in their country? I think this is a more like probably tragic example of what we were discussing with respect to what I spoke about before in terms of street protests and political mobilization, but it's very much on the table now, and we need to think in those terms too, I think.
And maybe I can just follow that up with a very linked question, thinking about the context of insecurity and what you've just been saying. Is this challenging reopening up new debates on the social contract within these very tricky contexts of insecurity, particularly in West Africa?
Yes, I think it very much questions some of the usual assumptions, for example, of liberal democracies. A lot of people are starting to discuss whether military governments or at least periodical phases, transitional phases where the military are also involved in the government, can or cannot be a more effective tool to solve such widespread violence. And so, yeah, the very nature of the democratic state, of the rights of citizens to elect their leaders and to participate in the work of defense is very much being discussed today. And I think that civilian politicians and civilian governments are struggling with this issue of recreating legitimacy for a democratic social contract that can secure legitimacy and long-standing commitment from all citizens through the guarantee of peace and security on their territory. But of course, it's a very challenging.
I see we have a question from the audience, which is also linked, and I'll read the point. Interesting topic and excellent presentations, Patience and Cristiano. The government in a government is a strategy that external forces are using to maintain statuesque in most African countries. This is particularly the case in the 14 so-called francophone countries on the continent. I'd like your take on the situation in these countries and their relationship with France and her interests and the current instability in some of these countries. I think probably that this is a question to you, Cristiano. I'm not forgetting your Patience, but Cristiano, would you like to comment at all before we turn to other matters?
Yes, I am not sure about what is meant here in a government strategy, or at least what are the external forces that are hinted upon. But of course, the role of France and its military, first of all, its long-standing military presence, at least in some former colonies in the continent, is under fire and is under very heated discussions by a growing sector of the populations of these countries in a very specific ways that it does not have any parallel, I believe, in other post-colonial relations of African countries with former colonial powers, which I think speaks to the tiredness and the relative lack of success of the Francophonie or the France-Afrique, more like the extended presence and foreign policy of France toward its former colonies, and the deterioration of security in this situation. So I think that the partnerships with France and the presence of military of French military in West African territory is being discussed and in some cases refused for these reasons, and alternatives are being looked for. So you have, for example, some sectors of young demonstrators turning to Russia and hoping, for example, that Wagner Group or other private groups based in Russia will take over, as they did in Central African Republic or in Mali. These are also, in a way, external forces, in a way. So which I think speak a bit to your first questions, Eleanor, the fact that even when African citizens and activists strive to redefine their own way of being citizens and relating to their own states, they position themselves invariably in a global landscape where, for example, international partnership and post-colonial relations, or the BRICS and new emerging powers at the global level, are elements of the discourse and elements to position oneself and to change the course of, or to change the meaning of this concept, to change the content of the social contract. So I do think that Africans have to deal with external forces in that way all the time, and are trying to build their own map of them, or have been trying to do that forever.
Yeah, thank you. Patience, if I could draw you back in, you were mentioning many challenges, and I'm wondering where you see the role of policy and policymakers in addressing these challenges. I realise that's very broad. You might want to narrow down who the policymakers are and the policy, but what do you see for the role of policy?
I think there's kind of multiple, dimensions to that. So there's policy in terms of drawing up, I guess, kind of, and putting forward, not just kind of, this is the situation and the context that is happening and the trends, but also working to kind of imagine what the possibilities are to have a much more inclusive notion of citizenship might be. And Cristiano talked at length about the social cash transfers and grants, basic income frameworks, and that, I would say, is that kind of policy space that imagines how one might include a broader range of actors that have normally been excluded, but also has a practical dimension in being able to kind of implement it. How do you make it work to ensure that rural residents, rather than just urban residents who've kind of normally been kind of working outside state infrastructure, are included in expanding identification, registration, and the like? And the challenge now, of course, is how to include people who are resident, right? And fall outside this kind of state citizen dynamic, but also having the states in those particular areas guarantee their access to entitlements and not hinder it. And I think those are the very kind of like practical aspects arising, I think, from a kind of policy context, and why policy in terms of actually these questions is really key.
Thank you, Patience. Henning Melber, Professor Melber, I know you're keenly listening. I was wondering if you have any observations in this line that you would like to contribute at this point.
Thanks for the invitation, Eleanor. I would like to start with a more global contextualization of the issue, because citizenship does not only matter for African societies, it matters everywhere. Of lately, Sweden is a classical case where citizenship is under new scrutiny and discussion. So it's an aspect of every state where you have to reflect on the role of citizenship. And citizenship has become a global commodity. In the times of the 21st century mobility, citizenship is purchased. We know of, to use one example, Russians having bought citizenship in Malta, in Cyprus, in the UK, you know, name it, as one of the most prominent examples, because it enhances mobility if you have a passport which allows you access to a bigger number of countries. So if you travel with a Swedish passport, you have a comparative advantage over someone who, for that matter, travels with a passport from Yemen, I would say. But it requires, as a first step, citizenship to be entitled to a passport. And that implies you need to have a birth certificate. You need to know how to get a passport as a precondition for that kind of mobility. And that touches on the issue of governance. Now, a state which is capable to regulate citizenship is not necessarily a certificate of good governance, because you can abuse the way you handle citizenship. But if citizenship is understood as a social contract, how it was also stressed by Patience and by Cristiano, then it is a give and take. And that relates to the rule of law. It relates to applying similar principles to everyone, in as much as these are entitlements and obligations. And it might create a sense of belonging, which is absent in more heterogeneous societies, or replaced by other identities. Reference was made to regional, ethnic, other identities which come into the picture and do not consolidate identity with a central authority called the state. So, and that identification is important. We see it playing out in sports at the moment in Qatar. Who are the fans of the football teams? Predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly citizens of the individual national teams playing. And that shows you identify with the society to which you are linked, not only, but also by citizenship. Citizenship fosters identity. It also allows for not only for inclusion in a positive sense, it also is a tool for exclusion. And there some of the African experiences come into the picture, where based on the definition of citizenship, people were excluded despite having been born and bred in the very same country by casting a vote in national elections. Among the most prominent cases was KK in Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, where the new government wanted to keep him out of politics and argued, well, the parents were born somewhere else. Another prominent example was Zimbabwe, where literally hundreds of thousands of predominantly farm workers were excluded from electing because their parents or grandparents came from a neighboring country, even if they were born and bred in Zimbabwe. So citizenship becomes a very powerful tool. In a way they divide, but it's also an opportunity in the sense of establishing reliable rule of law, sharing responsibilities. And this is the challenge when it comes to the question which was posed, how should policymakers solve these challenges? If policymakers are clever enough, and unfortunately very often they are not, then they see that creating identification with the government of a state enhances support, even if it's on the basis of a give and take, that in return you have to offer something for those who are recognized as citizens. But that means you integrate them. And let me just return to what I said at the beginning. It's a challenge not only in African countries. Maybe it's more visible there, but it's a challenge everywhere. And even more so in countries with a history of violence, of foreign rule. But that applies to many Eastern European states. It applies also to other states in the world. And it's interesting maybe to see how have these countries developed citizenship as a tool to integrate. And as a last observation, I know that several scholars, very critical scholars, they have asked me, how can you engage with citizenship and sell that? Shouldn't we transcend citizenship? This is enhancing identities of nation states or states, delete the nation, which we actually don't want to have. I understand the argument. I sympathize with the intention, but this is the situation in which our global world is organized. We are organized on the basis of states who have joined a United Nations, and where basically your belonging is defined if you transcend a regional identity, where you don't need to leave the region in which you live or the ghetto in which you live, defined by affiliation to a country, to a state. So even if in the long term your utopian wish is we should get away with that and reach a status of cosmopolitan situation, you can't just jump over that. If you come from a country in Africa, the first step to gain mobility would be to obtain citizenship, to be registered and to have the rights to travel. Otherwise, with no passport based on citizenship, you got it. So I think you might say this is very pragmatic, but I think it's very important, and it also helps to improve governance.
Thank you, Henning. Really pertinent points, and fascinating area in terms of the negotiations that are occurring around the social contract in relation to citizenship and the significance of citizenship and being able to be recognized as a part of a citizen of a state. And the processes that are occurring at the moment, for instance, in relation to protests, where people are trying to negotiate in different ways citizenship. Also, for example, in relation to entitlements, where, for example, cash transfers, it might be precisely one of the aspects of cash transfers I know because I worked on it myself, is to give people a birth certificate. And new children, this can be one of the aspects. So these processes make citizenship really a living issue, whether it's inclusion, exclusion, how one can move positively forward around this. And what I very much like in the work that you've been doing is that it opens up these questions quite broadly and the relevance of this debate to contemporary Africa today. I notice we're running out of time. I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth at this point and say thank you very much to each of you. Really appreciated your contributions. Elizabeth, can I please turn to you?
Thank you, Eleanor. All right, so we are approaching the end of this development research dialogue. And I'd like to thank everyone for being part of this important conversation. And in particular, I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Patience and Cristiano, and our moderator, Eleanor, for a very stimulating discussion. To make sure that you don't miss any future development research dialogues or other exciting events, let me suggest that you sign up at our website, swedev.dev, to receive the Swedev newsletter and also to become a member of the network. You have links for this in the chat. And to give you some examples of what we do, or some upcoming Swedev events, we are organizing a multidisciplinary conference for PhD students with a development research focus in their work this week. And this is co-organized with the School of Global Studies in Gothenburg. And we think that this is a really important effort to build a development research community for the future, not least because many PhD students are in other disciplinary environments in their everyday work. So to meet others who also work on development issues across disciplines is quite important. In August, we are also co-organizing the Nordic Development Studies Conference, NORDEV, this time together with Uppsala University. And this call for papers is still open. So more information about deadlines and calls for papers and the themes for the conference and so on can also be found in the chat. So this is a really good opportunity for many of us, I would expect, to present the research and to learn about the research of others. Also, please do get in touch if you have comments or ideas, comments on this development research dialogue, or ideas about speakers or topics for future events. We'd be very happy to hear all of your feedback on that. So again, on behalf of SWEDEV, as well as the Development and Aid Policy Group at SEI, thank you again for being part of this very inspiring dialogue today. Thank you very much.